On February 26, Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old boy, was shot and killed by George Zimmerman. Now, everybody agrees to those facts. They don't agree to any facts after that. And in fact, there has, of course, been an outcry across the country. He was not arrested for 45 days, George Zimmerman wasn't. And throughout that time, people across the country were saying, hey, listen, this looks like injustice to us. We have a report on that.
Trayvon Martin has become a national symbol of what many are calling the very real dangers affecting young black teens.
Justice! No peace! From coast to coast, thousands of high school students streaming out of schools today, wearing hoodies, now the symbol of the Trayvon Martin tragedy. The shooting of one unarmed black teen morphing into a debate about race and justice in America.
Now, George Zimmerman, 45 days later, finally was arrested and brought to court. Now, he's finally been released on bail after a lot of trial and tribulation on that count. And he sat down with Sean Hannity on July 18th for what can only be described as a bizarre interview. Let me show you a clip from that.
Is there anything you regret? Do you regret getting out of the car to follow Trayvon that night?
No, sir.
Do you regret that you had a gun that night?
No, sir.
Do you feel you wouldn't be here for this interview if you didn't have that gun?
No, sir.
You feel you would not be here?
I feel that it was all God's plan, and for me to second guess it or judge it.
Is there anything you might do differently in retrospect, now that time has passed a little bit?
No, sir.
Now here at the Young Turks Studios to explain that clip partly and to make a defense for their family, Robert Zimmerman, the brother of George Zimmerman. Robert, thanks for joining us. I do appreciate that. Up there, that to a lot of Americans seems really off-putting to say that he has no regrets. Would you take that one back if you could? What do you think he meant by that?
I think that George, first of all, thanks for having me, Cenk, for having me here as a representative of my entire family, everyone but George. George is a very profoundly religious person. I think people who are religious, we grew up in that Catholic tradition, they have a tendency to shy away from taking things back or suggesting other realities other than what actually happened. People who are religious, it's a tenet of their faith that everything...
But I'm not sure that every religious person would have reacted that way. Can you see how the family members of Trayvon Martin might be really upset if you say, hey, you know what, I didn't regret what happened, even though in a best-case scenario, in George's explanation, it's a terrible accident where a kid gets shot for no reason.
Yeah, I don't hear the same thing you hear, obviously, when I hear my brother talk about that. I hear that he doesn't have regrets how all of those things played out. Now, obviously, George, and he did say that, and you didn't play that, he wishes all of that would have happened some other way. He wishes there was something he could have done or some other circumstance that would have arisen. It is in that interview where Trayvon Martin didn't end up dying, but I don't hear it the same way you do.
So let's go to C7 here. This is part of the 9/11 tape, 911 tape, I should say, where it could have gone a different direction, because you said he wishes that he could have gone in a different direction. Let's listen to that together.
Sure.
This guy looks like he's up to no good, or he's on drugs or something. They always get away.
Are you following him?
Yeah.
Okay, we don't need you to do that.
Now, Robert, can you see, for a lot of Americans, they think, why is this guy following this guy? Why does he have a gun? And to say, gee, I wonder how it could have gone down differently. It could have gone down differently if you didn't follow him and if you didn't have a gun. Isn't that obvious?
Well, I think it's really easy to speculate when you're not there, and you just have to speculate about how things could have been differently. Now, George made the choice that he made. He was the only person there who survived this encounter.
The 911 dispatcher was there in a sense saying, hey, do not follow him. That's a bad idea.
Right, and George agreed with that person and stopped following that person.
Really? Because it certainly didn't appear that way. So if he's following Trayvon, they say don't follow him, he stops, then what happens next in your...
My view of events really doesn't matter. Facts matter, and the evidence that's been presented by his attorney in court are what actually matters. Okay. And that's what people, that your viewers, instead of having something just presented to them as fact, should actually look at court records as fact of what happened.
All right, so tell me what do you think happened there?
Well, in George's reenactment, in all of the written statements George has done, when George was under the new polygraph, which is voice stress analysis, and he said exactly what had happened, the operator told him, and that is an edited tape because right after that they asked him, so what is your name? And he said, my name is George. They said, we don't need you to do that. And he said, okay. And they said, what is your name, sir? And he said, George. He stopped following Trayvon Martin at that point. He never got to give that person.
So are you saying that Trayvon turned around and attacked the guy with the gun that he thought was following?
I'm saying that March 29th on CNN's air, on Piers Morgan Tonight, I gave the recount my brother gave to me. That account has been consistent. It's been the same account that George gave in his reenactments. And his account, as I understand it, is that Trayvon Martin did surprise attack him, and the first thing Trayvon Martin did to George was to break his nose.
And Robert, so I'm trying to get you to understand if the shoe was on the other foot. I mean, if your brother had gotten shot by a guy, and the guy had been following him all along, and he's got a gun, and he's calling the 911 dispatcher on him, and then somebody comes and tells you, oh, yeah, I shot your brother dead after I followed him. But trust me, in the moments that you can't see, he surprise attacked me. Would you believe that?
Well, you know what? In Florida, as opposed to Virginia, where I originally lived, you wouldn't know that someone has a gun. A gun is concealed. So people such as yourself who say he's following him and he has a gun, Florida requires you to conceal that gun. And people who take those courses know that that gun has to stay concealed. And taking it out is called brandishing it. So the gun was never exposed until George attempted to save his life by moving his head into the grass. When that gun was exposed, George didn't shoot someone. George prevented himself from being disarmed and saved his life.
Look, that's a funny way of putting it. I know you're his brother, and I might say the same thing if I was in your situation. But you can see from Trayvon's family's perspective, it seems like a weird thing to say that, yeah, I followed the guy, yeah, I had the gun, but then I saved my life by, jumping on top of the guy. But look, let me put it to you a different way. Can you see why there was an outcry to at least have him arrested? Because nobody's saying what the jury should decide. I'm not saying that. I don't think anybody in the Trayvon Martin family is saying that, etc. But to say, hey, wait a minute. Now, for example, in the beginning, George Zimmerman doesn't get his criminal background check, but they check the victim, the guy who's dead on the ground. They check his criminal background. Toxicology, they don't check it for the shooter, they check it for the victim. Can you see how a lot of people thought, wow, what an injustice?
You know what? I can see two things, Cenk. I can see that there's obviously been injustice in the way that blacks have been treated in our justice system. There's obviously a disparity or perceived earn their credibility. Used any word white, black, or Asian to
but wait,
deny
I didn't
people's...
ask you about race. I mean, look, the racial points that you make are interesting ones, but I'm saying the kids on the dead, no matter kids on the ground, the guy who got shot, no matter what race he is, he's got a bullet hole in his chest. They check to see whether he's guilty.
Right,
and the guy who did the shooting, they don't do any checks on him. Can you see how that might seem like a gross injustice?
But what I'm tying that into is it seems to a gross injustice. What you're alleging is it seemed to black people that a black kid had been treated in some kind of an unjust way, as opposed to the white man who shot him. But that's not what actually happened. Now, those questions that were raised at the beginning, if they were questions that were raised about the police department, if they're questions that are raised about procedure, they may, in fact, be fair questions, but those questions that are directed at Sanford, the city of Sanford, and how the police does their job, cannot, when they are not answered because those answers are not forthcoming by politicians, cannot then be directed at, well, now George has to answer him, or he's a racist and he's a white man, and therefore they are one and the same. Those answers were not forthcoming.
It's not a matter of George being a racist. It's a matter of should he have been arrested. And the country was up in arms for 45 days.
It is a matter
because they were saying, hey, look, why do you assume the guy who's dead is guilty? So, but I got to move on to one critical thing here.
Sure.
Now, is it correct that you think that there was a huge scuffle there? I mean, obviously, George thought, according to his account and your account, that his life was in danger. Mm-hmm. Is that what happened, a big scuffle?
Well, what happened will come out in court. That's absolutely what I agree to. Yes, there was some kind of encounter that started with Trayvon Martin breaking George's nose. Mm-hmm. And whatever else happened after that will come out in court. But what the story is about is what your viewers heard when they heard the word, according to them or according to what you put on the air, coons. So it is about George being a racist. And if you read the comments that your viewers write, saying he is a racist, what it is that he hates blacks people. It actually, the story does become about that person being a racist because he is white.
All right, just look, you keep going back to the racing, let me just address it real quick. The concern there isn't as much about George as it is about the authorities. Why do the authorities make the assumptions that they do, even though one guy is dead and the other one is the shooter? So that's a whole separate issue,
I think we can agree on that,
but on the issue of the scuffle, you see, obviously, George, yourself, you say there's a big scuffle, the nose is broken, pounding his head into the ground, and et cetera, and oh my God, he's going to grab for the... But when they do the DNA test, there's almost none of George's DNA on Trayvon Martin and hardly any DNA from Trayvon on Zimmerman. Now, how could that be if there was this enormous scuffle?
You know, if I were a forensic expert, I could explain how DNA can and can't be. Obviously, I'm not a forensic scientist, and neither are you. So anything that you say or I say is just simply speculating, and it's speculating for your audience. It's not actual journalism. Journalism would be asking a person who's an expert in that, how can that be? Mm-hmm. And somebody more qualified could answer your questions as they pertain to evidence. But because he's my brother and because his life is hanging in the line, I'm not going to comment specifically on evidence.
All right, I hear you. And look, and we've had experts from DNA, you know, whether it's scientific experts, whether they're former detectives, et cetera, on the show. You were here, so I wanted to give you a chance to explain it. And, you know, now that you're here, I got to ask you one last question. Forget George, yourself. Do you regret what happened? Do you wish it hadn't happened that night? Do you wish George hadn't gone out that night, especially with a gun?
You know, my brother always goes out with a gun, like many, many people do in the state of Florida. The gun is always concealed. It's a human story. I wish at the end of it, nobody would have died. So I don't regret, I can't regret by proxy any of George's actions because I wasn't there. You know, do I wish he wouldn't have gone to Target? If I had the power to wish things away, I would have made sure he never went to Target, you know, but I don't have that power, so I have to let what happened stand as what happened, and then the courts will decide based on evidence what actually happened.
All right, Robert Zimmerman, of course, standing up for the Zimmerman family. Understandable. Thank you for joining us on the Young Turks.
Thanks for having me, Cenk.
All right, now when we come back, well, the entitled rich, they are a fascinating set. Wait till you find out who might be Mitt Romney's Treasury Secretary and what he thought he was entitled to.